So I've been studying a 1721 tragedy called The Revenge by Edward Young, which is an afterlife of Shakespeare, and that the plot is more or less copied from Shakespeare's Othello. And I look at the history of this play in the 18th and 19th centuries, and specifically its relation to the Romantic movement and the abolitionist movement. And I use this play to show how the moral responsibility of the theater developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. So The Revenge, like Othello, is a play about a man who is tricked into trying to murder his wife. The difference is that in this play, the man being tricked is a Spanish general, not a Moorish general, and the villain is a Moorish slave named Zanga. And Zanga's motivation in this play is to take revenge against the general for conquering his country, killing his father, enslaving him, and then, to add insult to injury, hitting him. And regardless of the author's intention in making the Moor the villain in this version of Othello, the effect was actually surprisingly not to vilify African people, but instead to make this African character pretty sympathetic. In fact, the play was criticized a lot in its time, in the 18th and 19th centuries, for making evil seem too attractive. Because the dominant idea, of course, was that if you're going to write a villain, you have to make the villain ugly. Like Shakespeare's Iago, for example, is a very ugly character. He speaks in a lot of grotesque sexual innuendos, whereas Zanga, the villain in The Revenge, has a lot of grand, noble speeches that make him a more appealing and compelling character. And so there was the idea that this play was even dangerous because it sent the wrong message and made revenge look attractive. But while that made the play controversial, on the other hand, you have readers in the Romantic movement, for example, Lord Byron, who saw this moral ambiguity, this sort of uncertainty in the play as a positive thing. The Romantics, of course, liked this kind of transgressive, violent energy in a work, and they famously believed that Satan was the hero of John Milton's Paradise Lost. In the same way, Lord Byron wrote that Zanga is actually the hero of The Revenge, despite all the apparently evil things that he does. And Zanga is, of course, he's very iconoclastic, very transgressive, and very thoughtful and introspective as well. And so he appealed to a lot of the things that the Romantics looked for in a character, even though the play didn't really serve a moral function. It didn't teach any lessons. The Romantics praised the play, and Zanga in particular, for their aesthetic value. So it was the play's kind of difficult morality that made the play popular among the Romantics, and yet morality kind of got reintroduced into the play during the abolitionist movement when the black actor Ira Aldridge played the role of Zanga. Up to that point, of course, the role would have been played by white actors in blackface. And 1833, of course, is when slavery was abolished in Britain. And for a lot of people, just the fact that a black person like Ira Aldridge could be a Shakespearean actor was an argument against slavery, because people would go to the theater expecting some kind of novelty or curiosity, and instead their prejudices would be shattered. And so if you combine that sort of implicit statement with a play that is about an enslaved person taking revenge, then you have the opportunity for what at the time would have been a really new and powerful moral statement. And what you see in reviews of Aldridge's performances is that people really started to talk about this play in relation to the ongoing issue of the slave trade. So even though by the end of the 1840s the play was basically going out of style, Aldridge was still able to introduce a new moral function into it. Now after this point, the play wasn't really performed again, it was basically forgotten, and that raises the question of why we're talking about it. And for one, I hope to have shown that the play is a good example of looking at how the Romantics and how abolitionists approached the moral responsibility of the artist, specifically in the setting of the theater. The play is also helpful in understanding how we think about Shakespeare. I mean, it's significant that when Edward Young, for whatever reason, wanted to tell this weird story about a slave's revenge, it was Othello that he copied. Which goes to show that for a long time when people thought of African people, it was Othello that they thought of. So that when someone like Ira Aldridge wanted to be an actor, Othello was his most common role. And for a while, Zanga was one of his most common as well. These sorts of roles were really his way into the theater. Which goes to show that works like Othello have had a huge role to play in shaping the way that people have understood race throughout history. And we see that very well in the history of how The Revenge has been interpreted and reinterpreted during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Thank you.